Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science webinar on our Stakeholder Needs Assessment with State Fish and Wildlife Agencies. I'm Gregg Garfin. I'm the University Director of the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or SWCASC. And I was also the lead investigator on this needs assessment. The co-investigator, Aaron Haverland, is unable to join us today. Aaron, as I will explain in a few minutes, did the bulk of the research and analysis on this needs assessment. But our communication director, Sarah Leroy, is joining me here in our conference room in Tucson, and I'm going to hand it over to her to describe how we're going to conduct the question and answer period.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. So Gregg's going to give a presentation for, I don't know how long,
about half an hour.
About 30 minutes, perfect. And then after that time, we'll have a Q&A. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you should see, and that's how we'll handle all of the questions. You can type it in there as we go, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll address the questions in the order that they're entered. If you have any logistical questions at any point, feel free to type that into the chat window. And if you could send that to, there should be a drop down that says all panelists. That way I'll receive it and I can answer that question that you have there. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we're recording this webinar today and we plan to post it on our website. I don't know if Gregg has that listed anywhere, but it's the SWCASC.arizona.edu, and I will send an email to all of the the participants today, letting you know when that's posted and sending the link.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, onward and upward here. For those who are not familiar with the Southwest Climate Adaptation, briefly, we're a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of universities in the Southwest US. Our mission is to provide objective science information, tools, and techniques that natural and cultural resource managers can use to anticipate, monitor, and adapt to climate variations and changes. We do this by fostering collaboration between scientists and resource managers and identifying best practices for partnership, because that's been proven to be very effective in infusing science information to inform decisions. Our consortium is hosted by the University of Arizona, which is also where our USGS partners sit, and we have 6 consortium partners, 3 in California: University of California at Davis, UCLA, Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. In Nevada, our consortium partner is Desert Research Institute. In Utah, it's Utah State University. And because the Colorado River is such an important feature to our region, we have colleagues at the Colorado State University who are also part of this. Excuse me for just a second. I'll be speaking today about a forthcoming report on this needs assessment with state fish, game, and wildlife agencies, and we've entitled it Toward Effective Actionable Science. There are a few typos in the PDF, and I imagine that we will get that all squared away by the end of the month and release it then. I'd like to acknowledge that the project was funded through a cooperative agreement between the SWCASC and the USGS, As I mentioned, I'm the lead PI on the project, Aaron Haverland, co-PI, and we were assisted by Kristen Vandermolen from Desert Research Institute, a postdoc there, and a graduate student here at the University of Arizona, Sarah Randall. I'll start off by giving a little background about how we collected the data and where we collected it. Then I'll talk about the findings and what we intend to do with this needs assessment. So the project period, we started off in the fall of 2017 and ended this spring. We did the active data gathering in 2018, covering our 4 key states, Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. And our objectives in this assessment were to get a grip on the highest priority climate science topics and needs from state fish and wildlife agencies, understand perceptions of barriers or opportunities to collaborate together to produce actionable and usable science, to collect feedback on the ways that people who work for those agencies would like to communicate and engage with us, and also collect feedback on any training and extension needs. We started the project in the fall of 2017 by reviewing some primary source documents, including state wildlife action plans and state climate plans. We conducted a number of structured listening sessions that I'll describe in more detail in a minute during the course of the spring and summer of 2018, and then conducted an online survey on communication and training preferences in the fall of 2018. And throughout the year, Aaron conducted interviews with various key people at state agencies or people who were unable to attend one of our listening sessions. And Aaron conducted the interviews and the survey so that I wouldn't bias any of the results, but I did take part in the structured listening sessions. We convened these listening sessions in California with the California Department of Natural Resources, California Fish and Wildlife Agency, and the Ocean Protection Council. In Nevada with the Department of Wildlife, in Utah with the Division of Wildlife Resources, and in Arizona with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. A typical structured listening session took about 3 hours and had an agenda like I'm showing here on the screen, starting with a presentation by the state agency about their responsibilities and operations and some of their challenges, followed by a presentation that I gave about the SWCASC, how we operate, who our consortium members are, and our expertise. And then we convened a joint roundtable discussion to talk about climate science needs, research needs, communication needs and interests, and so on. The interviews, Aaron conducted 24 interviews with 27 people, and with a whole raft of questions that mirrored the kinds of questions that or concerns that we covered during the listening session. So some of that was about the agency roles and responsibilities, their needs for climate information, current partnerships, and so on. I'm showing here on the screen a few selected questions. So, are there particular species of concern? How do you currently use climate-related science products, analyses? Do you use seasonal forecasts or climate projections? And what other kinds of forecasts might be useful to you? Do you have a policy for addressing uncertainty? And we also investigated the kinds of time and spatial scales that were important for natural resource, wildlife, and fish management. With the communication and training preferences survey, I believe that was 9 questions that focused on current partnerships with regard to garnering climate information, needs for various kinds of assessment products. We wanted to get some quantitative information of ranking for research priorities, understand needs for various kinds of training activities and guidance. So, for example, in the online survey, how likely is your organization to use the following kinds of things in decision-making, such as synthesis reports on the latest climate science, information about climate and habitat connectivity, and so on? Or what kinds of activities would you be willing to attend as a participant, whether that would be something like a webinar-based training or information session, or an in-person workshop. The report also contains some juicy information on a state-by-state basis, where we list some specific state-specific concerns and science questions, as well as species of concern. And we also devote an appendix to direct the reader to some of the state wildlife action plans and related documents. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about the findings from the assessment. And I'll just make the caveat that I'll focus primarily on a synthesis of commonly mentioned issues or issues that came up as high priorities across multiple states. And then I'll also frame them in terms of how those intersect with the mission of the SWCASC and our current science priorities. But we are definitely mindful of those very state-specific issues and needs as well. So in general, we heard a lot about the following overarching themes. There was a strong interest across states in science related to the way climate affects or will affect species, their habitats, connectivity, and wildlife migration corridors and disease. Strong interest too in sub-region synthesis on climate science findings. So reports like the National Climate Assessment look at a 6-state Southwest region, and often natural resource managers are more interested in a watershed or sub-watershed scale kind of information. Translation of data into usable formats, sometimes climate information, particular projections of future climate. If you want to look at spatially comprehensive data, can be in very unwieldy formats. Fish and wildlife managers are interested in examples of successful adaptation strategies and how those have been implemented, and understanding the efficacy of some of the measures that have been taken. They're also interested in guidance on how to infuse climate information, forecasts, and projections into agency decisions. and guidance on climate communication, which can be sometimes a touchy topic in our part of the world, maybe excepting California. Some sample science questions of the many kinds of questions that we heard in the listening sessions and in interviews. For example, there were some questions about effectiveness of treatments given projected climate changes. So how might the integration of climate science help us to know more about the status of species or restoration efforts, translocations of species, and the evaluation of our interventions and how we can use that to inform management decisions? Or what are the characteristics of climate resilience wildlife corridors, and how can we articulate those in ways that help make it easier for us to plan for wildlife corridors and garner funding? And then in almost every subject matter, there was interest in these complex interactions between climate variations and projected climate changes, and then non-climate factors that also affect wildlife, such as the expansion of urban areas or changes in transportation or construction, all of which can lead to pollution or more human-wildlife interaction, and understanding how climate might augment those interactions or the frequency of those interactions. There were 4 overarching science and resource management topics, and these shouldn't be surprising to us given that we live in the Southwest and that we were speaking with fish and wildlife managers. So fire is a key concern, invasive species, diseases, plant and animal diseases, and snow and water. So I'll spend a little bit of time going into some of the details about those overarching topics. For example, with fire, there was a interest in predictive tools that consider a wide range of timescales and scenarios. And I'll focus on the scenario aspect. Our sense was that that resource managers would like to be able to ask some what-if questions of fire modeling and fire prediction efforts, so they could better understand how to plan for upcoming fire seasons and for future changes in fire regimes. Strong interest in understanding shifts in vegetation by elevation zone based on the prospect of changing fire regimes, and understanding how both native and non-native species might fare in changing fire regimes and how that might affect habitat and whether certain species would thrive. In terms of invasive species that include not just the plant or vegetation species like this cheatgrass in the photograph here, but also aquatic and other species, actionable science is needed to understand how we build resilience into ecosystems given the combination of climate change and in species invasions. Understanding how climate variations and changes might affect the identification and protection of refugia for species of concern given species invasions. And then how does climate modify or augment initiatives to eradicate invasive species? With regard to diseases, there was interest in understanding the linkages between wildlife health, disease vectors, and climate change, in particular to understand whether a warming and perhaps more arid climate might lead to abundance of some disease or disease vectors, or it might be that the toxicity of those diseases might change, or that in fact, some of those disease vectors might wink out in a warmer and drier climate. There's also concerns about addressing some novel, whether there'd be introduction of novel pathogens, parasites, fungal infections, and insect vectors given projected climate changes, and understanding whether those changes might affect the transmission of disease from wildlife populations to human populations. Understandably, there was a lot of interest in changing snowpack and hydrology, especially given a lot of the recent science and communication about snow drought, earlier snow melt, and reduced snowpack in our region. So there was concern for science that would help in protecting aquatic species given projected increases in warming temperatures in streams and reservoirs. Using some of the or interest in understanding how hydrology might change and how that might affect hatchery conditions. So understanding prospective changes in runoff, base flows, and nutrient loads. Also understanding possible changes, again, with regard to fish, in whether, and this is on a seasonal time scale or an annual time scale, understanding whether we can use snow drought information or snow drought forecasts to inform decisions on whether to seed fish in particular streams, and whether that we could use that sort of information for proactive decision making. Also, similarly, understanding how hydrology might change for snow-fed bodies of water and streams, and whether wildlife managers will need to set out additional water troughs or create additional green spaces for cooling, for example, for big game or ungulate migration. And then a concern about these changes in snow and hydrology and how those intersect with non-climate factors that related to water, such as changes in population, water demand, and development, and how those might affect non-game species of concern. From our listening sessions and interviews, we boiled down a lot of different topics into what we refer to as emerging science and communication needs. So I'll go through those in this next section. There'll be a little bit of overlap with some of the things I previously mentioned. So understanding the climate impacts on water availability and water quality, again, and that intersection with some of the non-climate demands on water, and how those might affect management of wildlife populations, particularly with regard to the wildland-urban interface. Integrating snow drought data and snow drought predictions, or emerging snow drought predictions, to manage the health and wellness of species where populations are dependent on snow-fed water sources. looking at the array of fire modeling efforts in simultaneously, again, so managers can ask what if sorts of questions that include things such as there was a particularly strong need for modeling potential stand replacing fire, but also looking at the effect on habitat and wildlife given projected prescribed fire, changes in tree mortality, fire intensity and frequency, and then the response of vegetation. So that's an entire fire and forest research agenda that could be quite ambitious right there. Another emerging science need is for integrating data, water and temperature data into the databases of Fish and Wildlife agencies so that they can apply that information to decision-making about aquatic species and fish species. There were some communication emerging needs for guidance on climate change relating messaging for the general public, but also for special interest groups like state wildlife commissions and also indigenous communities. Also, needs for better integration of climate science into watershed and landscape scale conservation efforts. And for the scientists who are taking part in the webinar today, certainly this has been on the front burner for a long time, but the sense that we got from speaking with Fish and Wildlife stakeholders was that we're just scratching the surface on how to integrate climate science into these efforts and how to understand the effectiveness of integrating that information into landscape scale treatments. And then a last set of emerging needs are understanding how climate change will affect habitat connectivity, migration corridors, understanding how climate change will affect particular species, whether those are native species or invasive species, threatened and endangered, and then also the associated pathogens and diseases that affect those species. And finally, with California in mind here in particular, there's this confluence of impacts in the zone, the nearshore zone, where marine life overlaps with terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, such as ocean acidification, harmful algal blooms, increases in sea surface temperature, and sea level rise. So that's an important set of issues for California. We distilled all of this into some research and communication priorities for the SWCASC by looking at the intersection between the CASC mission and the kinds of science and communication needs that we heard from our conversations with Fish and Wildlife agencies. So again, the research priorities focus on those 4 key areas, with fire being one of the leading areas, and particularly looking at this issue of stand replacing fires, how those affect ecosystems, and can we improve forecasts. Introductions of invasive species and how those affect ecosystem function. Climate change influences on animal and plant diseases, and improved understanding of the effects of changes to snowpack, snowmelt timing, and this phenomenon of snow drought, and how those affect habitats. Some of the science needs were not for novel or cutting edge science, but simply for synthesizing and assessing existing science. And so some of those needs included synthesizing information related to changes in snow hydrology, and coming up with syntheses of these landscape scale infusions of climate science to inform landscape scale conservation initiatives, and also cataloging the examples of successful implementations, understanding how to evaluate that success, and conveying those sorts of things to fish and wildlife managers. Also, assessments of sort of the state of the knowledge with relation to climate science related to particular watersheds or particular issues. And together, these synthesis and assessment issues kind of boil down to how is climate science being used and applied to fish, game, and wildlife management. Some outreach priorities from our survey showed that there was a strong preference for in-person meetings and briefings, and to bring it to the state agency offices, and to convey information in kind of bite-sized summaries that are easy to understand, which overlaps with some of the communication priorities that we heard about. So again, guidance and products for communicating climate change science, in particular to hunters and anglers, state fish and wildlife commissions, and indigenous communities, and supporting that again with facts and figures and information that's conveyed in a way that's simple and easy for lay people to digest, but that's backed up with credible and legitimate science. Some of the barriers to working together to co-produce science and to convey some of this science include mismatches, for example, in spatial scales. A lot of the existing research and assessments are done at a state or regional or national level, and that's a mismatch with the need for information at watershed or sub-watershed scales. A lot of the state agencies have a need to address issues du jour and short-term demands from the public. Some of them are also constrained to use particular models in their work that might not be the cutting-edge research models used in peer-reviewed science. Also, many times funding is earmarked for activities, and that makes it a little more difficult to bring adaptation to climate change into the fold as a high priority for these agencies. Many agencies are constrained by their resources and their capacity to devote human resources to work closely with SWCASC to produce usable science. There's also a lack of ease in communicating climate science to some of the key constituencies. Given the preference for in-person meetings, there's a resource limitation for the SWCASC to conduct a whole lot of in-person meetings, but I think we can, and I'll talk about it in a minute, I think there's some ways we can be clever about that in ways that we can leverage certain activities. And then we heard also that the loss in particular of the landscape conservation cooperatives as key intermediaries for communicating climate science and also coordinating some of these landscape scale research initiatives was a key barrier. In terms of some research opportunities for the SWCASC, one is aligning with policy initiatives when those come up, such as the new California climate adaptation plan, Safeguarding California. We can also leverage our investments in the SCENIC climate data tool so that on the back end of the SCENIC tool, we have an interface with state agency data management protocols so that we can export data in formats that are useful to those agencies. And then there are some topics like habitat connectivity or migration corridors or priorities set by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, where we can pool our efforts with those of adjacent climate adaptation science centers. And these are sorts of initiatives that we've done in the past and that are opportunities for us to stretch our resources to answer some of the science questions that we heard about in the needs assessment. In terms of synthesis opportunities, it takes a lot of resources to produce synthesis and assessment reports. And so one of the ways we might be able to augment that is by putting together rapid response teams that we could convene in a webinar format like this or at some of our in-person meetings to answer specific topics that came up in this needs assessment. And that's also an opportunity for us to use our annual stakeholder meetings and our occasional climate summits to convene state of the knowledge panels where people would be able to ask questions and get rapid answers to those. We see an opportunity for working with dedicated state agency liaisons like the liaison from the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources to Utah State University, and to leverage scenario planning initiatives in order to examine some of those complex non-climate, climate, society, wildlife interaction kinds of issues. In terms of communication, we will use some of the information from this assessment to match the kinds of topics that we will do in future webinars with the needs expressed in this study. And then given that there's a lot of need for communication and training with regard to climate science and how that interacts with wildlife, disease, habitat, and so on. The degree to which we can increase our cooperation with other federal initiatives like NOAA-RISA, the USDA hubs, and the BIA-funded tribal climate science liaisons will help us in spreading the word about a lot of good and important science. So some specific recommendations for the SWCASC are to focus on those 4 overarching science themes: fire, snow and water, diseases, and invasive species, to put some of our efforts not just towards original novel science, but also to synthesis and assessment, to find ways to address these complex problems with cascading impacts, perhaps by using facilitation processes or leveraging facilitation processes like scenario planning, and to make the most of every in-person opportunity that we have to foster or reinforce partnerships and to communicate our science. So I'll just conclude with saying a little bit about what we're planning to do with this report. We will use this to inform future USGS requests for proposals and also to inform our communication and workshop priorities. And I'll mention that the SWCASC is in the process of finishing up a few related assessments, one of the science needs for federal agency stakeholders, one on the needs in particular of aquatic resource managers and those related to ungulate migration, and then to combine those with a pre-existing assessment that we did a couple of years ago on tribal adaptation science needs. So I'd be happy to take your questions. Please use the Q&A box that Sarah referred to earlier.
Great, thank you, Greg. We actually have a couple of questions already.
Okay, I'll start here with a question from Elizabeth Fard. If you had multiple stakeholders and managers together for a workshop, what breakout group activities would you recommend to facilitate dialogue and engage participants while also gaining information about their needs and priorities? Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that we're making part of our standard operating procedures in terms of understanding about needs and priorities is to try to look at the intersection of science initiatives and planning initiatives. So if agency partners know that in 2 years they're going to be updating their wildlife action plan or some resource management plan, then that's an opportunity to align our science capabilities and our information and synthesis and assessment activities to inform those sorts of documents. Also, I would say there's any number of breakout group activities and ways that we could, that one could possibly convene breakout groups. And I think, Ellie, it would be easier to talk about those offline because those will, a lot of that will depend upon what you would like to get out of those breakout groups, whether it's simply assessing needs or whether it's prioritizing or whether it's trying to align the science with the particular planning needs of resource managers. Another question from Ellie Fard. How would you follow up after these stakeholder meetings in order to keep communication open and ongoing? Okay, so that's a great question too. Thanks for asking that question. The important thing, the way I like to frame this is that every engagement is really like a marriage proposal. And, one of the keys to good marriage is good communication. So you want to make sure that you touch base, and that means even touching base to just see, well, how are things going, or to let people know that, oh yeah, we're still working on this stuff right now, and we've gotten only so far in our efforts, and making sure that people know about possible opportunities for funding where you could follow through on some of the doing research to meet some of those needs, and so on. And what we learned from this assessment is that there was really a strong preference for in-person communication. If I remember correctly, it was something on the order of 58% of the survey respondents said that webinars would be an way to do things, but in-person was really important. And it doesn't necessarily mean following up with a specific meeting, but rather inviting others maybe to come to a session at a conference or a symposium or at a science day on your campus. Those would all be excellent ways to keep up the communication and help keep people abreast of the latest science. Question from Tamara Wall. Thinking about your conversations with natural resource managers, did you get a sense of what climate variables and at what scales they are most important? Because that relates to key research, as it relates to key research areas outlined in this presentations. For example, are there particular scales for research on animal diseases? So, I don't have that at my fingertips. There was certainly mention of looking at things on watershed and sub-watershed scales. I don't think we garnered any information about on a topic-by-topic basis, but Aaron is the keeper of the notes on that, and I could follow up with you if you've got a particular topic of interest. Other questions, comments? Something happened in the chat window, no? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for making the time to take part in the webinar. As I mentioned earlier, I expect that in a week or so, we will be conveying the report on our website, and I know that Sarah will be blasting out a bunch of communication with regard to that. And I see another question here from Nikki Cooley. Will you be doing another assessment in the future? Great question. So yes, we will definitely be doing another assessment in the future. And we're going to be doing ongoing assessments. So one of the things that's part of our work plan is to make use of annual SWCASC stakeholder meetings, and we're going to be convening those in each of our partner states to update our assessments of science and information and communication needs, as well as garnering information from what our investigators hear during their interactions with resource managers. And then as we get towards the end of our 5 years of funding, and we're just finishing our first year here, we will probably do another formal needs assessment so that we've got some good information as we write the next proposal. Any other questions, comments, insults? All right, thanks again for taking part in the in this session. As Sarah mentioned, we'll be posting the report. We'll also be posting a recording of this webinar. Well, wait a minute, one more question. Okay, they're dribbling in here. From Dan Cahan, did your interactions with land managers indicate that the management community is collecting longitudinal data? So that's jargon for data collected in time slices over time. That is vital to understand and predict climate influences and impacts. often many questions are limited by lack of information. So the sense that that I got trying to dredge back through my recollection of conversations that we had last summer in particular was that this kind of longitudinal information is collected for game species in particular, and the kinds of species that hunters and anglers are, most interested in, and then to some degree for threatened and endangered species, particularly if there's a need for repeat data gathering related to some upcoming ruling or something along those lines. But it seems to be that most of the that kind of data gathering, it really focuses on the so-called money species in particular. Another question here, from Ted Mellis. What advice would you give to encourage scientists to create or support the creation of fact sheets? Okay, good question. I would say that certainly there's an interest, in my somewhat pejorative term here of bite-sized bits of information to the degree that you know it. If you have some understanding of the particular watershed or sub-watershed of interest, and you can drill down that far, there's enough information available. It seems like there's a lot of interest in sub-regional scale information. And I think the other thing that we've learned from doing fact sheets is to really make sure that the overarching messages are stated really briefly right on the front page, like the very first thing you say, and then reiterated at the end. As scientists, we typically like to tell a story that starts with, well, here's the methods we used, and here's how we analyze the data, and here's all the interesting, complicated stuff, and then here's the conclusions. And that makes for a nice scientific story, but for fact sheets, and I think, many folks, and I'm guessing, Ted, actually, that you know this too, that just broadcasting headlines helps a lot in getting the message across. More questions? Yeah, okay. So thanks again. We'll be posting the webinar and the report. And after we close out here, if you come up with another question, feel free to send it to Sarah. You could send it to me, and we'd be happy to email you an answer or give you a call on the phone. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks for all those great questions.